Hello and welcome. I'm James Milan. I want to introduce a series of conversations that we have facilitated here at ACMi on the ballot questions that voters will be voting on June 11th. Question 1 is the debt exclusion to fund the new high school, and question 2 is an override. What we have done is gathered folks to provide the strongest arguments possible, both pro and con, on each of those questions. And then we've given them all the space and time that they need to make those arguments as well as they can. So without further ado, we'll proceed into those arguments now. Enjoy, make the best use of them that you can, and don't forget to vote on June 11th. Hello and welcome. We are enjoying tonight a conversation basically to flesh out the arguments against question 1, the debt exclusion to fund the new Arlington High School. Joining me today to provide those arguments is Aram Hollman. And Aram, we very much appreciate your being here. I wanted to get something out on the table right away before we go further with the conversation, and that is, to clarify, you're here today arguing against, arguing for the idea of voting no on question 1. Does that mean that you don't think that we need a new high school?
No, I think we do need a new high school. I am not interested in a rebuild or a renovation. After a century, it's time for something new. My opposition to the debt exclusion is strictly as a matter of cost. It's too expensive.
Okay, thanks for that, and we will certainly give you plenty of time to explain all the ways in which that is the case. But viewers may be curious, and I'm sure you would like to let people know for yourself just what brings you to this question. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about
a little background, a little biography. I've lived in Arlington for a little over 20 years. I'm a homeowner. Therefore, I'm a taxpayer. I served in town meeting from 2003 to 2007, so I'm aware of the kind of debates which go on. I am generally pro-education and pro-education spending, so in a way it surprises me a little bit to find myself opposed to a pretty significant chunk of education spending. It's not the way I'd usually go on issues like this. In this case, it's an exception.
Mm-hmm. And have you been involved in, previous school rebuilds, or are you aware of those? Is that part of what brings you to the table today, or?
What brings me to this is I grew up in Newton, and I graduated Newton North in the building that was just recently demolished, which when I went to it some decades ago, that was the new high school. It was a public construction disaster. It lasted 35 years and then was torn down and was built by the current Newton North High School. And my parents still live in Newton, and I was pretty keenly aware of the drastic cost overrun that took a building that was supposed to clock in at about $144 million and with various problems ended up being $200 million. And that sensitized me to the whole issue of construction costs for public schools. And before that, the high school, the poor one that I went to, was part of a whole decade of poor public construction spending. And that also sensitized me to the issue. So that's why I got concerned with this. That and the fact that it's expensive.
Right, so your conclusion is unequivocal, and that is that this is too expensive as a project. So why don't you go ahead and start to lay out your argument for why that's the case?
Sure. Well, I mentioned I grew up in Newton, and the high school I went to was expensive and had a lot of problems, and I'll skip some details on that. And as I'm fiddling with this, that was the initial issue. And in Arlington, I think a lot of people share it. I think there's just a gut reaction of, this is too expensive. That's all.
Okay. Have you been? I assume you've been following the process.
Yeah.
The whole way.
I've been following the process. I attended the town meeting at which an overwhelming 90+% of town meeting members voted in favor. And so I'm aware of the fact that, to put it politely, I'm in a minority position. I'm quite aware of that. But I'm wondering if I could do some, this is what originally got me interested, could I make some comparisons of Newton versus Arlington? Newton North, which was finished in 2010, about 9 years ago, to Arlington, because this is what originally motivated me.
Sure.
Okay, so just some of the numbers. Newton has, I think it had 1,700 students when it was first built then. It now has 2,100 students and is still growing some. Let me compare that to Arlington. 1,325 students. Build out, what the high school is planned for, 1,755.
So currently 1,325, you're saying, and
going up to 1,755 with the significant increase in school population that we all know has happened already and is going to continue to happen for a while. I'm keenly aware of that. So why are we, and Newton was 200 million, this is going to be more like 300 million, 291 to be precise. There's some differences in the facilities. For its money, Newton built a swimming pool. We're not building a swimming pool. Newton is a comprehensive high school. It has 12 different vocational programs, each one requiring significant significant space shops with expensive equipment. Arlington is not a comprehensive high school. It's an academic-only high school because voc ed kids go to Minuteman, for which we've spent some 30 or 40 million, but that's a separate issue. So, again, why are we paying so much more for so much less? Size. Newton, with its significantly bigger population that I mentioned, is 420,000 square feet. These are just the hard numbers. Arlington, with a significantly smaller population, is a tad short of that. It's 413,000 square feet. Why are we building, comparatively, per student, such a large high school? I don't understand that. I really don't. One of the standard metrics for any construction project is cost per square foot. For Newton and for Arlington, if you divide out the square footage by the total cost, Newton, $476 per square foot. Arlington, a whopping $704, almost 50% more. Now, I know, to be fair, we're on a constrained site. Newton, they were able to build one high school in one place, build the other high school in the other, and then tear down the old one. Arlington, we're building in place, and I understand that that's going to raise the costs. And I also understand, hey, this was done almost a decade ago, there is inflation. But still, 50% more? Again, I have to wonder about that.
So you're, just to clarify,
Sure.
you are acknowledging that there are some elements that are different about this building project that could account for a greater expense.
Absolutely.
But it just doesn't add up in your,
no, it doesn't.
From what you could tell.
Combined with the smaller student population, the fewer facilities that we're building, we are spending more and getting less. And I don't think that's all inflation. I don't think that's all vocational programs that Newton has. It's a combination of all these things. I wonder, it's simply too much. And I've heard lots of references from the proponents about the educational program and how the educational program drives the other things. It drives how many classrooms, how big are the classrooms, what are the other facilities. I've heard that. And I'll have to admit, I haven't delved into the educational program. I've looked at it. It's too much detail. But I'm simply doing a basic cost comparison of one school versus another. So my original motivation was Newton. I started looking at, well, what do other high schools cost? Those that are being built, those that have been built. And so I started doing some research. And I just came up with a number of different figures: cost, number of students, cost per square foot, what facilities they have, whether or not they're what's called a constrained site. And by a constrained site, I mean one like Arlington, where you don't have two separate sites. You have to build basically on top of what you're doing, and you have to juggle kids and construction equipment in close proximity. So I'd like to show people some of those comparisons. I've got two charts that I'm going to go back and forth. On this chart is some partial information which I'd like to go through. I will not go through every single number in here, but
Can I just ask before
Sure.
you start, just where did these numbers come from?
These numbers come from a variety of sources, ranging from Globe articles to websites for those municipalities to Arlington's own building project. I have not footnoted every single number here with a source. I can't do that. I'll have to ask viewers to give me the credibility that I'm not making up the numbers.
Fair enough.
Okay? So, I mean, Arlington is pretty near the top here at 291. If you look, Belmont is about the same at 295. However, Belmont is going to combine a middle school and a high school. And together, they're going to have 2,000 kids there. Same price, 50% more kids. Somerville, a very, very constrained site. I don't know if you've ever seen where Somerville High School is.
Okay.
It's at the top of a hill. There is a 60-foot drop to the railroad track. There is a 30-foot drop to the parking lot. It's even more constrained than Arlington. They are also a vocational high school. They have all those expensive voc tech shops. Waltham looks like it takes the cake with $381 million. Why is it so expensive? Because Waltham is taking another plot of land and is going to have, via eminent domain, and is going to have to pay for that. And they've built in the cost of acquiring land. That's something which no other system I've seen has to do. Lowell, $343 million. It sounds like a whole lot more, but Lowell is 4,000 students. That's a whole lot bigger. Why are they accommodating 4,000 students for only $50 million more? I got to wonder about that. And as I said, cost per square foot. I don't have the figures for most of these high schools. Again, Arlington really tops the list. There is another chart which I will not bore you with. The Mass School Building Authority has charts showing for a bunch of middle schools and high schools what the cost per square foot is. Arlington is off the charts. I know people in Arlington say it's all for the kids, and I mean no disrespect. But what does make them so special that we need to spend 50% more than people are spending on kids in Newton and Belmont and Wellesley? Or Somerville and Waltham? Or in Boston? I just don't see it. We don't have the voc ed programs. We don't have the swimming pool. I don't get it. So I looked and I found one other chart because some other communities have had similar results. And on this chart, which I'm displaying, these are numbers for Winchester. They had a school building project. I am not going to go through every set of numbers here, but if you simply scroll down, and I'm hoping this is visible to readers, if you simply scroll down and compare, there are a whole lot of other schools which for the most part were built earlier, clearly, but you've got figures of under $100 million here. And these are frequently for schools that are the same size or smaller. So again,
and all of those were, I see that the earliest date that you cite for the buildings was 2006 for Woburn there.
2006?
So everything is, within the last 15 years.
Yeah, and I realize again, construction costs do go up. We're in the middle of a building boom. And I fully realize that. But still, this is way, way out of sight. So that's kind of the hard numbers concern here. I think I've made the case that our numbers, our costs are really high. I'm concerned that our building is too big. During the town meeting debates, a lot of people said, is this going to be a LEED certified school that is energy efficient? People talk about spending money on geothermal, and I think with climate change, all of that is great. But the biggest single factor in heating a school is the volume. And at 413,000 square feet, I think we're building something too big. And if you're really concerned with energy efficiency, you ought to be concerned with space. And I just don't see it. And I'm sure that somebody could cite me chapter and verse from Arlington's educational program about why 413,000 square feet is appropriate. I'm sure somebody could. What are other schools' educational programs? How are their educational programs so different such that they can get by with less space or less cost? We're all in Massachusetts. All these schools have educational programs. They all have to meet Massachusetts education standards. They all have to meet NEASC standards regarding buildings, curriculum, teacher, etc. Why are we so different? Why are we so far off the chart? I don't follow that. And I haven't gotten what are, to me, convincing answers. And so that's why I am opposing the proposed debt referendum and asking people to vote against it. Not because I don't want a new high school, but because I want one that is appropriate, and one that is appropriate for Arlington.
On that, let me just ask you for, again, clarification purposes. If people were to vote no, what would follow from there, do you think? What would you hope that, in addition to people voting no, what would be the next thing that happens if things were to go as you would like?
I'm going to backtrack to one thing and then answer your question. The original request for proposals were for proposals at the level of around 150 million. When all the bids came in for roughly twice that, the building committee should have put a stop to it right then and there and said, what's wrong? Instead, they simply went ahead, which for the construction community is basically a way of saying, oh, whatever you're going to charge, we're willing to pay. Now, I understand NEASC has imposed a deadline on us. We have decennial certification of the high school. NEASC has said, your teachers are great, your curriculum's great, your building, on the other hand, is a serious problem. So I understand the time is of the essence. But I also understand that you need to do something that is appropriate for your community. If this vote fails, and it requires a 50% majority, then I think the members of the building committee can and should and will reconvene, and they'll say, what can we do that's different? What can we do that will cut the cost significantly? Maybe the question is, what should the number be? Maybe it isn't 150 million. Maybe it's going to be 200 million. Maybe that might make sense. I'm not an expert there. I don't pretend to be. But we need to do something appropriately sized for Arlington. Newton, which had a cost overrun, is a city of 80,000 people. We are a town of 40,000. We have a 95% plus residential tax base, almost no business at all. We are not as affluent in terms of household income as is Newton or Belmont. So when I say something that's appropriate for the community, I don't merely mean the number of classrooms and the number of square feet and how many theaters we have. I mean something that the town can afford. And right now, I have been hearing from too many people who say, this is unaffordable. This is too much. I'm looking at my tax bills. I'm looking at the recent tax jump. That's too much. So I think they will need to reconvene with the architect, with the construction manager, and say, what can we do? Now, there's precedent for doing this. About 15 years ago, we had to renovate all 7 elementary schools. The original proposal was to spend $50 million renovating, all 7 elementary schools. The voters turned that down. They said, that's too much. We're worried about cost overruns. The planning committee for that went back and they came up with another proposal. They said, let's take part of that money, watch the construction very closely, monitor it, prevent cost overruns, and do 4 schools. And then, if we have a satisfactory track record on that, as a matter of equity for all Arlington residents, we have to do the other 3 schools. That was a fair approach. The voters voted for it. So Arlington does have a history of saying, let's be a little bit more fiscally responsible and still get the good education system that we want. We did that then, we can do it again now.
Let me ask you, and again, I'm not doing this because as a counter to your argument, but rather because I think it's too big a topic to not mention, not to bring up. So I wanted to ask you about the fact that all indications are that the MSBA, Massachusetts School Building Authority, which at this point is ready to contribute 30% of the cost of or to provide 30% of the cost of the school. All indications are, if we vote no, that money will go away. That my understanding is we go to the end of that line, to the bottom of that list of potential projects. So I just wanted to know what your response is to that, or how you would address that consequence of a no vote.
That's a legitimate concern. Again, going back into the past, which is something that's done and we can't change, Arlington could have and should have done high school a long time ago. It's 30 or 40 years now. That's how we had a renovation every 30 or 40 years. It should have done this a long time ago. It should have started saving money so we wouldn't have to borrow as much. And it could have waited till a bust in construction. Right now, we are in the middle of a boom when the prices are highest. That's not good planning. But given the situation now, consider that the MSBA refined its rules drastically after, I'm not sure what to call it, the snafu in Newton, because the MSBA felt that it and the taxpayers of Massachusetts were being taken advantage of. So beforehand, the school would come up with a plan, and they'd basically just say yes or no and give a certain amount. After Newton, because of what happened, they said, no, we're going to allow you to build only this much on our partial dime. If you want extras like a swimming pool, television studio, anything like that, you can have it, but we're not going to contribute to it. The MSBA is there to save taxpayers money when they're investing in educational facilities. It is not there to spend to the max. I think we've built up, and this is thanks to the building committee, we've built up a lot of credibility with the MSBA. They know that we have a good plan. But I think if we go to the MSBA and say, hey, our voters turned this down because it's too expensive. As a town, we need to save money, and that will save the MSBA money, which then can be used for some of the other many schools that also want this money. The MSBA, they already know that we need a school. I think if we said to them, we need another year or so, and we'd like to get back in line, and we hope you'll give us the money then, I think they will. Am I guaranteeing that? Absolutely not. But that's a sensible thing for the MSBA to do. The politics are right. It's financially and politically a logical thing for them to do. It makes complete sense. It's a little bit like the kid who gets into college, is admitted, and then asks to defer for 1 year. We're canceling this project, but what we're really doing is asking for a deferment, and we have every intent of coming back with another, better, more efficient project. It will cost Arlington less money. It will cost the MSBA less money. That's what I think we need to do.
Okay, thank you. I probably interrupted the train of your argument, which may have finished with the numerical or hard data part, but maybe not. Again, I don't want to cut you off from anything.
No, I think that's enough of it. I mean, one of my concerns is that it's very hard to change people's minds on this. Most people have made up their minds it's unlikely that they will change them. I think it's worth a try. I appreciate the fact that ACMi is having both proponents and opponents of both this and the tax override here to publicly say why they are for or against. That's what American democracy is about. I think it's much better to have a discussion like this than one of these back and forth debates like we've seen on TV. This makes a whole lot more sense. But I did want to move on from some of the numerical stuff to some of my other concerns, which are a little bit less hard numbers. They're a little bit less tangible. They're really more about, and again, this is the softer part of it, what kind of a community do we want Arlington to be? Because when you spend this kind of money, you're making a decision that's going to run for decades down the road. And that's going to affect who can afford to live here. It's going to affect how much housing costs. It's going to affect what property taxes are. Those things all come together. This is a bigger decision than financial expenditure than Arlington has ever made. It's a one of a kind so far. Hopefully we won't repeat it. And you need to think about that a little more. When I moved here 20 years ago, the complaints that I heard was, Arlington has an almost all residential tax base. Almost no business. We need more business. That's what I heard. At that point, hard numbers some, the town's tax base of somewhere, it's now between $9 and $10 billion, was about 95% residential, 5% business. I believe that in the intervening 20 years, it's come closer to 96% residential, 4% business.
That's
so
what
we
I
have been
understand
going
as well.
very slowly in the wrong direction. And one of the reasons is that every time somebody rebuilds, the market right now is telling developers housing. Market rate housing is the most profitable thing to build on any land in Arlington because we're a bedroom community to Boston and Cambridge. So what's best for Arlington and what's best for developers are two very different things. They want to build market rate units. So Arlington has gone in 20 years from about 20,000 housing units to 21,000. We've only built 1,000 units. 3 projects contribute to most of those. The Legacy, right in Arlington Center, the former Sims Hospital project, and the Brighams. Those 3 are a little over 500 of the 1,000 or so units that have been built in Arlington over the last 20 years. And each time we did that, we lost a space that would be good for business, and it is now irrevocably residential space. So our chances of creating more of a business tax base are diminishing. We don't even have a split tax rate. That is, we don't charge, as many towns do, one rate for businesses and one rate for residences, because if we had a higher rate for businesses, they'd be driven out that much more, and businesses are hurting. They've got internet competition. A lot of the spaces here in Arlington are small. I understand that. But we need some business for residents to work in, for residents to shop in, and to help chip in a little bit more toward the taxes. Make sense?
Yep.
This is as much a financial thing as it is a soft thing of who gets to live here. But the prices, I'm sure you know what Arlington housing prices are and how they've escalated. Arlington is growing less and less affordable. We have a master plan. It talks about welcoming diverse people into town. I've publicly said Arlington has become a gated community where the gate is not some wall around the town, but it's the high housing costs. So this has, our rising prices also have implications for who lives here. It sounds like ethnic diversity, racial diversity is not a problem, as long as you have enough in your checkbook. And that is a problem. I don't think that's the kind of town some people want to live in. Now, if you ask people, does that matter? Some will say yes, some will say no. But that's a real issue. Do you want to live in a diverse community, or don't you?
And you're talking about, in addition to racial and ethnic diversity, economic diversity is
Yeah.
going to be affected, I think is where you're going with
Exactly. Arlington is also officially supports affordable housing. The recent proposed upzoning would have given a lot of money to developers by upzoning those parts of the town which are already the most densely populated. Already. The 5% of the land area along Mass Avenue that currently houses 25% of Arlington's population, that would be upzoned. And for people who don't know what that means.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Zoning limits what you can do with your property. It says you can build only so high. It says if you build a house, it needs to be set back a certain number of feet from a street or a property line. If you can simply build out further, if those limits are relaxed, you can build more, and that's more profitable. What the town of Arlington recently tried to do was to upzone the most densely populated parts of town along Mass Ave, and with a bonus for affordable housing, saying if you build more than the required 1 in 6 affordable units you're required to, we'll give you all sorts of bonuses. The problem is that's millions for developers, and it will create only a token amount of affordable housing. And when I say token, I mean measly, trivial. The big money here is for developers. We need a housing policy and zoning ordinances that are good for the town of Arlington, not good for developers. And this is where my conversation does kind of cross over into town issues and municipal spending.
Right, so just connect it for us and for the audience to your concerns about the building.
Okay, the issue is that right now a lot of people have told me we need to keep good schools to keep up our property values. We have a vicious cycle going on. We need good schools, those prop up property values. Increased property values means the price of housing goes up. That means more affluent people can live here. They all sound like good things. Nothing inherently wrong with that. People who want good schools. Left out of that are the people on the lower end. Where are they going to live? How are they going to afford, let's see, the place right near Stop and Shop where I believe 2 bedrooms go for $3,000 a month. Those are not the kind of housing prices Arlington is used to. This is where you start freezing out people because you spend so much on schools, because people afford it. There is no room for people of more limited means. Again, 20 years ago when I moved here, the complaint was that Arlington's own hired servants, its policemen, its firemen, its teachers, could not afford to live in the town where they worked. 20 years later, that is still mostly the case. Where are they going to live? Is it fair that they work here, but they don't get to live here? What is philosophically, and this is not something which is easily translated into policy, what is a town's obligation to those citizens of lesser means when it contemplates really big spending decisions? Is there any such obligation? Years ago, an internet troll on the Arlington list, a little bit a la Marie Antoinette, said, those who can't afford Arlington or afford high housing costs, let them live outside 128. Is that the attitude we want? Is that inclusive? I don't think so. Somebody might say, let them live outside 128. And that's their opinion. That's not mine. I don't share that. We talk about affordable housing. How are people going to afford even the affordable housing? I don't know. An anecdote, I recently ran into a friend of mine, somebody who lived in Arlington long before I did, who said, basically said, I'm leaving town. Said, Arlington has changed, and although I've been here about 35, 40 years, it's changed in ways I don't like. There are some other changes in my life as well, but a lot of it is really Arlington. And so since I'm running into you, I wanted to let you know I'm on my way out. There are other people on the Arlington list who have written to me. I can't afford this. I'm going to have to move out. I've lived here all my life. I don't know where I'm going to go. So this is not a hypothetical issue for a philosophical discussion. This is real. Can I continue to pay my property taxes and live here? Or do I have to tap into my retirement, much as many parents may tap into their retirement to fund their kids' college educations? Do people have to tap into their retirement or their housing equity simply to continue to live here? Is that the kind of town we want? Numbers. The proponents of the debt exclusion for the high school estimate that for the average sized home in Arlington, paying off the debt will cost $800 a year for 30 years. For anybody over 50, that chances are that's not a temporary debt exclusion, that's for the rest of their life or for the rest of as long as they continue to live in Arlington. That's $800 a year just for that. That's in addition to the recent tax increases.
Absolutely. Let's just clarify one thing, which is it steps up to that $800, right? Incrementally over the next few years of the building.
I think
right?
It gradually steps up, but it's going to be like that for the bulk of the 30
Fair
years.
enough.
So I'm not going to quibble about maybe it's not quite that for the first 5. That is what it's going to be once
enough.
all the construction is done. So I'm just going to go with the 800. I also realize it's in proportion to your assessed value. So that's for an average home in Arlington. That's not for everybody. It could be more, it could be less. But you have to look at what are property taxes doing. Right now, they're going up a couple of hundred a year for everyone. That's just the standard 2.5% increase in the tax levy that is voted on without fail every year. But as a town, and this is where it does get into municipal spending, we are spending both beyond our means, beyond the 2.5% tax levy, and certainly we are having increases in municipal spending that exceed the increases in most people's household income. Yes, there are some people who are doing very well. That's not everyone. Again, this is the equity question. What obligations do we have to consider for those of lesser means when we embark on a very big spending project like this? Now, even with something scaled down, okay, even with something scaled down, suppose we get this knocked down to 200 million, just hypothetically. That's quite possible. So it won't be $800, maybe it will be $500. That's still a lot of money, but that may make the difference for some people, whether they can stay here or whether they can't. We certainly should try to do what we can. In many ways, Arlington is very well managed. The town is pretty tight with a buck when it comes to regular operations. When it comes to capital spending like this, that's another story.
Okay, I want to make sure we've got just a few minutes left of our allotted time, but I want to make sure that there is nothing that you wanted to say or to more fully develop that you haven't had a chance to do.
That's pretty much it. I could say roughly the same thing again and apply it to other populations with limited means. We have elderly people in Arlington living on fixed incomes. They're retired. The concern is there. We have people who are the only breadwinner in their family. Again, limited income. We have lots of people who would like to live in Arlington, many times because of those good schools. And that's a worthwhile thing. I believe education is an inherent good. It's good. We need it for democracy. We need it for citizenship. Those two things are far more important to me than preserving property values. So I'm all for education. But what really makes a good school? It's not the building. It's not the library. It's the teachers. We have a pretty good group of teachers. To the extent that we spend, let's say we could get this down to 200 million rather than 300. That's 100 million that we have to spend on something else. That something else may be better roads. It may be paying teachers. It could be anything. But we ought to be as wise about figuring out how to spend that 100 million that we might save as we do with anything else. So again, I'm appealing to people to vote against this override, not because I don't want a new high school. I do. But I want one that is fiscally sensible and sensible for Arlington.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and I'd like to thank the folks at ACMi for doing this. I appreciate it.
You're absolutely right. Lots of people that can't be seen on camera who make all the difference here and actually do almost all of the work, to tell you the truth. So I want to echo Aram in thanking our ACMi crew and volunteers, and thanking you as well for tuning in and listening, and of course thanking you, sir, for presenting a strong argument on the idea, with the goal of persuading people to say no on question 1. That will conclude this conversation. We appreciate your being here, and we, as always, urge you to vote on June 11th. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm James Milan.